Come on in. Gerardo, thank you very much indeed for that session. Yes, we're going to move straight on to our next session. That's money laundering and tax evasion, the risks and the cures for a clean sport. I'll just take my seat as well. And that was a very impressive turnaround. Thank you very much. Oh, Jane, Jane, I beg your pardon. Come. No, you come here. I'm taking your seat. I'm standing at the lectern for this one. I beg your pardon. Well, let me introduce our panel because we have 5 experts here. I was going to say not a sportsman or woman among them, which is not true, but none are coming to us from the field of sport directly. This is dominated by financial and legal experts, and I think that in itself is a reflection of just how serious some areas of our sporting world have become, particularly in terms of money laundering and tax evasion. So let me just run through our panel, and I'll start with Jane. Jane is closest to me here. Jane Lute is the former Deputy Secretary of the Homeland Security in the US, of course. Rick McDonell, Executive Secretary, Financial Action Task Force, or FATF. Jennifer Shasky Calvery is the Director of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network at the US Treasury. Ruth Bailey is Head of Investigations and Surveillance, Corporate and Personal Banking of Barclays Bank. And on the end, Daniel Thelesklaf is the Director of the Financial Intelligence Unit, the Principality of Liechtenstein, and also Deputy Chair of Moneyval and Chair of the Egmont Training Working Group. So thank you all very much indeed for joining us. I had to say, when I was first presented with the characters I had on the panel, and I'm seeing Homeland Security in front of me and issues about the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, flippantly I was thinking Sopranos and Al-Qaeda, and it is a flippant remark, Jane, but nonetheless, I think your presence here says something about the severity with which this issue is now having to be dealt with. I mean, how big a deal is this?
As I think our first 2 panels illustrated, it's not only a big deal from a business point of view, and notwithstanding some disdain for politicians, it's a big deal from a political point of view, from a financial point of view, from a social point of view, and from a cultural point of view. We may not be active athletes on this panel, in my case by a long shot, but all of us are connected to sport in some way. We've either played sport, watched sport, contributed to sports, or our children do. It's literally a phenomenon that touches everyone in the world at some time in their life. The purpose of Homeland Security, it was originally created, is to help in the United States create a safe, secure, resilient place where the American way of life can thrive. And sport's a big part of the American way of life.
Jane, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to ask Daniel next, actually, if you could just explain for me, I mean, you're looking at financial intelligence. How much do you know about the money laundering and the tax evasion going on in the world of sport, perhaps compared to how much you're able to get to?
Let me first confess that I'm Swiss. Given some remarks in the morning, I need to confess. I do belong to the minority who has never received money from a sports organization.
I didn't know that you had to confess to being Swiss now. It's a sorry state of affairs.
Where I think we're learning more and more. We have increased knowledge about that. I think we all have quite significant knowledge about how criminal organizations work in general. And probably I do see more resemblance actually in what we're seeing in other organized crime cases in some instances. In some organizations we have talked about, I do see very little sports actually. I see business, and I see huge amounts of proceeds being generated, which just brings you in a more risky area. It doesn't mean it's illegal at all, but if you deal with this amount of money, there is an inherent risk of crime in that business. That's logical. I know my colleagues from the banks would like this to be different, but the reality is if you deal with such amounts And we have seen from the investigations individual transactions of very significant amounts. So I think we know a lot about it, not specifically so much in sports, but we know how these organizations work, how they generate profit, how they try to hide their assets, and I don't yet see a lot of distinction between what we are seeing in these cases and what we are seeing in others.
Okay, Jen, could you perhaps expand a little bit on that, but also give us a sense as to what you do in your world, and that idea of the way in which crime is infiltrating sport?
Sure. So I'm the director of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, as David mentioned, which is the financial intelligence unit for the United States, so the counterpart to Daniel's organization. And what we do is collect the reporting that financial institutions provide and others provide on suspicious activities. And then we use that reporting to support law enforcement and other government bodies in their efforts to fight money laundering and terrorism and other national security threats. FinCEN also plays another role. We're also a regulator. We're the lead anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism regulator for the United States as well, which means we set the rules that the banks and other financial institutions have to abide by when it comes to trying to keep dirty money out of our financial system and providing reporting to us as the FIU. Prior to being the director of FinCEN, however, I spent about 15 years at the Department of Justice as a prosecutor. I began my career on the investigation team of the Salt Lake City Winter Olympic bribery scandal. Went from there to become, primarily for most of my career, an organized crime and money laundering prosecutor, where the topic of criminal infiltration of sport was a constant, quite frankly, throughout the years. I must admit, I also bring a personal view to the issue of sport. I personally played basketball growing up, was a part of our Olympic development program in the United States, played at the collegiate level, now sit on the National Athletic Advisory Board for my university, where we talk about these types of problems at the national domestic level. And my brother played professional basketball in the NBA and about 7 years here in Europe, in Italy, Greece, and Spain. So these issues are something that are certainly common to me. And as Daniel said, the criminal and organized crime relationship to sport is nothing new. The way that we look at the finances of sport and the complexity of the transactions, the opaqueness of the transactions, the opaqueness of the ownership, the international movement of funds, the use of shell companies, the cash intake at sporting events, all these things make sport, and just the vast sums of money, of course, are vulnerabilities for sport and puts them at risk of money laundering, tax evasion, fraud, corruption, and criminal infiltration.
Ruth, not very attractive clients.
No, they're certainly classed in the way. Well, we have to look at each client on their merits, of course, but yes, having the sporting industry is now clearly there's some issues that we need to think about. So from our perspective, as a banker, or actually within the financial crime division of personal and corporate banking, obviously banks have regulatory and legal obligations to put in place systems and controls to reduce as far as possible the risk that they are used as a conduit to money laundering. And my role is effectively to conduct investigations into potentially suspicious activity on the part of our clients in corporate and personal banking, and also to oversee the automated transaction monitoring systems that an institution like Barclays absolutely needs to have in order to be able to look at the activity of their clients and decide whether or not it is normal course of business or potentially some form of crime or money laundering. And actually, some of the investigations that I would carry out may end up going to Jen and obviously the NCA in the UK. And for us, those legal and regulatory obligations are very important. If we do not have the systems and controls in place, then we are also in grave danger of being sanctioned and having enforcement, fines, etc., from our own regulators. So it's incredibly important for us When you're taking on clients such as sporting industries or sporting associations, anybody associated with them, that we understand who they are, what they do, where their money comes from, and what constitutes normal for their behaviour. And if we don't do that, then we are in breach of our own obligations. So for us, the use of shell companies, etc., is a very difficult thing for us too. We need that transparency. And just to make it clear, tax evasion is in fact what we would call a predicate offence under the UK legislation, which means that it's an underlying offence, it's a crime, and the proceeds of that crime would therefore constitute money laundering. And it's that actually gives us the obligation to try and detect it, try and prevent it from happening through our bank.
That's the state in the UK.
That's the state in the UK.
But clearly not the
it's
case
not the same
everywhere.
Although, interestingly, there is new legislation which has just been enacted from the EU, which is known as the Fourth Money Laundering Directive, and it is now going to make tax evasion a predicate offence throughout the whole of the European Union. So that will obviously help in the fight against tax evasion in particular.
Rick, could you spell out a little bit how, am I right in calling FATF? It's not the prettiest acronym, but how that fits into, because it's a much more of a macro picture here.
Yes, perhaps I should, like Daniel, first confess something too, that I watch sport on TV. Unlike Jennifer, I don't participate in it any longer. But the words have been used this morning which are very descriptive in one sense of the way the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, we usually call it FATF just to avoid that insinuation. There are standards, they're world standards. So the things that have just been described by everyone else on the panel stem from the fact that there are global standards and they're meant to, if you'll forgive the pun, apply on a level playing field around the world. They do not yet apply on a level playing field because of capacity constraints or in some places unwillingness to act. But on the other hand, there are now mechanisms, structures and capacities, if I can go that far, which exist in most countries, in fact the majority, where the issue and the practice of money laundering has a basis for some success in stopping it or preventing it, or if you can't do that, to detect and prosecute it. So for example, the suspicious transaction reports, which the banks have to report to financial intelligence units like FinCEN, that's one of the basic tenets of the international standard. So it's all about the money in terms of criminal money, proceeds of crime. Who has it? How do they transact it? For what purpose? Where does it go? How do you prevent it? And if you can't prevent it, how do you detect it? So these structures are in place, which the financial institutions that, for example, Barclays just mentioned, have a whole slew of mechanisms to determine on a risk-based approach, I want to explain that in a second, determine whether there are transactions which need to be reported to the appropriate government authority, which is the financial intelligence unit in most countries. I mention the word risk because for two reasons. One, that's the basis of things. We don't expect the banks to be policemen, but we do expect them to know who their customers are. We expect them to know who their actual and real customers are and not fictitious names. That's another fundamental tenet. But the word risk also applies across the board in terms of what sorts of risks are we looking at in terms of who gets some reports done to government on their transactions. For example, and I take a slight personal risk here because we're in Switzerland and therefore I'm going to say something about Switzerland. This morning there was comment about the politically exposed persons principle being applied to officials of international sporting organisations and others in this country. I personally think that that's a very good thing to do, and the risk of it being applied wrongly to persons who are, say, at local level or junior level, or as I think the example was given, at some small profit organisations of sport. That's not how the system actually operates or should operate. The risk-based approach means that the financial institutions look at their customers, they have an appreciation of who they are, what types of transaction profiles they have, and if something unusual occurs, they make a decision based on their risk assessment as to whether that type of transaction needs to be reported. So I would guess that where the risk on a broad basis is very low. We're not talking about much money. You know the customer, they're regular clients, nothing is out of the ordinary. That would not affect those people and they would not be reported on. So I guess my first answer to your question is partly, are we getting anywhere in terms of stopping or at least preventing to a degree, and if not, detecting and then doing something about money flows that are illegal proceeds of crime, which is what we're talking about in this whole session. I believe we are, and I think that there is a disincentive then built into the minds of people who want to transfer their money illegally and hide it, because that's what money laundering is, hiding money, so that the authorities can't find it and you can use it for something else, often anti-competitively. That was another word that was used this morning. That there is now a structured approach globally to try to reduce, if not eliminate, the incentive to do that.
Okay, we'll look a little bit further at how far that's going. Jen, but you wanted to jump in there, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on some of the comments of my colleagues. In the United States, we do not consider sport officials to be politically exposed persons. That idea of being a PEP is important, because if you are a PEP, there's enhanced obligations by financial institutions like Barclays in terms of supervision and collection of information and monitoring of the financial activity of that individual. We do, however, have the risk-based approach that Rick was mentioning. And you might be interested to know that on the plane over here, I was reading an article put together by a consultant to financial institutions, a very well-regarded consultant in a highly read journal in our industry, suggesting, he was analyzing the FIFA indictment, and he was suggesting to industry that they should now consider certainly FIFA officials, if not broader sport officials, to be high risk. And so that's going to have implications when you ask, how much do we know? How much intelligence do we have about sport officials? I think we're about to get a lot more. We've had some, but these types, whether it's indictments or reassessments of risk, increase the amount of intelligence that we receive from financial institutions. That's going to go to law enforcement, and so there is going to be more heavy scrutiny. So when we talk about whether there should be a move, whether you should still have self-regulation of sport or whether government has a role, I think what you've seen already through the FIFA indictment and what you'll see ongoing is that law enforcement is going to become your regulator of last resort. And you don't want them to step in. By the time they step in, now it's a scandal. Now there's people who are facing imprisonment. We're talking about forfeiture of properties and proceeds. And so to prevent that regulator of last resort from coming on the scene, you need a strong intermediary, whether that's self-regulatory or otherwise.
Right, we've just had the regulator of last resort coming onto the scene, haven't we, with regard to FIFA? So that's exactly what is happening. Jane, I mean, I know you don't want to dwell particularly on the FBI and its role here, but it's happening now anyway, so we can talk probably till the cows come home about the value of codes of conduct and the need to get an international agreement on X, Y, Z. But if it ain't happening, it's not really worth talking about, is it? And the bottom line seems to be, we've needed the FBI, we've needed the law enforcers to come in to make any change.
I hope someone's recording this for the Bureau. But let me speak about how should we think about governance? How should we think about government, the role of governments in this regard, and then maybe in particular the role of the United States as it's manifest most immediately on not only on the FIFA issue but on other things. Governance. You know, what we're looking at sports governance of the major federations and communities around the world as a reaction to precisely the same thing we're reacting to now. These federations and associations and this industry grew up because sport became too lucrative, too important, and too consequential to lead to the athletes. Remember, this all began with athletes on a sporting pitch or a playing field, playing a game they love. And then we all came to watch them. And then we paid. And money began to accumulate and change hands and grow. And so now we've seen the emergence of a very complex, very elaborate system of governance of sport. Without, in all cases, the standards that Rick talked about being obvious, visible, and enforcing. So the question naturally becomes, what should the role of government be? And again, notwithstanding, the people's opinions of politicians, governments, we think governments should be run by politicians, and if they're not, something's wrong. If they're run by military or other people who have not been duly elected, we think something's wrong with that government. So we think that they do have a role here. Well, what do governments are supposed to do in our lives? Provide threshold conditions for security, well-being, and justice, and that includes in sporting events. In the United States, there's a big conversation going on right now, for example, about drones and the flying of drones over sporting events, not only for the risks that they might pose and the dangers that some are concerned may have terrorist origins or other nefarious purposes, but also because of the intellectual property from photos that these drones are able to collect and promulgate, largely unregulated by anyone, and there's a lot of money changing hands. So there is a greater burden being placed on sports governance. If we want them to be a standards-based institution, we need to know very clearly what the standards are. They need to be based on transparency, inclusivity, reciprocity, and accountability. People need to clearly understand what their responsibilities are, be held to them, and have penalties imposed. Final word about the United States. And I must say, it is quite lovely these days to be an American in Europe. You hear wonderful things about being an American. That has not always been the case in my lifetime. And just so you can all rest assured, we're on every train that's operating today in Europe. In the United States, though, we have no single official in the administration responsible for sport. That has to change. I think we need a senior sporting official in the administration. I think the way we find out where that person goes is the president appoints a task force, gives them a 60-day deadline to say, come back with recommendations about how the United States government should organize itself to pull together the various parts of the administration and of our government that deal with sport so that we can get greater cohesion and, yes, a greater sensibilized approach to standardization.
Okay, Jane, thank you very much. In a way, you talk about drones. I get a sense that some of you are drones looking down over this world of corruption and money laundering and tax evasion and being able to spot from time to time where it's happening and perhaps even managing to get to the root of it. But Daniel, can I ask you about that idea as to, there's a big drive, we're all in this room partly because of a big drive which has come from the States, from the FBI, and tackling it sort of head on. How important do you think that is?
Well, the United States play an important role in the financial architecture of this planet. And I think that gives them an enhanced responsibility also to react on that form of crime. But they're not the only ones. I think there's a very broad coalition of like-minded countries who see things exactly the same. So one party may take the lead, but others join in. And if I remind you, my way home brings me along the Hotel Borolac in Zurich. And some people may know it, and even if you don't know it, if I showed you a picture of the back door of that hotel, and I put some bed liner in it, you will remember what I mean. That's the door through which people came that were arrested a few weeks ago, the senior FIFA officials, Mr. Blatter friends who were arrested. Why do I mention that? I mention it because I think that was a change. There was a fundamental change happening. We have been talking about crime, corruption in sports for a long time, and I think my colleagues in the morning mentioned that. The media have been covering that. How frustrating must it have been for you to see nothing is actually changing? But from that day on, and I'm not saying it was useless, quite the contrary, it was very important to build that up, but that was actually the change maker. For the first time people have been arrested. These people lived in a state of impunity. It was common knowledge that sport is corrupt, but the follow-up was very, very limited. But from that day on, things have changed fundamentally. We had the banks on board, willingly or unwillingly, but you are on board because you don't want to be prosecuted for aiding to money laundering and abetting to money laundering. And we have a far better arsenal and far better knowledge about what we're doing. And that's only the start. I mean, an arrest for an extradition request is just the start. We will see much more. Some of these organizations are very wealthy, and we could possibly argue that these are, at least to some degree, proceeds of crime, which gives us an instrument to freeze and eventually confiscate proceeds of crime. We can see more people being arrested because they are responsible for the organization. Nowadays, we don't need to prove that somebody has actually committed a crime. If you are, as a manager, are responsible for the activities of a legal entity, you are liable for that, criminally liable in many countries for that entity. So to be honest, I would be very worried if I worked in an organization, in a corrupt sports organization. I would be very, very worried. And I'm hoping very much that this will be a driver, jointly with all the other drivers that we have discussed, civil society and others, that we will finally succeed. But it was necessary. I have the impression we will not have that tone of the conference. We will probably have a good conference here, but probably a totally different tone if that had not happened in Zurich, what had happened at the initiative of the US authorities and supported by the Swiss prosecutors. And just one last word. We also have to see that things that we have tried to do in the past didn't really help. So there's a lot of good advice. There were a lot of highly paid consultants around. A lot of code of conducts were created. If we are honest, they haven't really made a difference. They may support the action that will be coming now, but what made the difference was very, very concrete action. And that's an experience we see in other forms of serious crimes too. The mafia won't reorganize itself. You need somebody else doing the job.
Is that a remark, and I've got this completely wrong, is that a remark in part to the likes of Rick, for example, at FATF? It's not yet achieved anything, and that's the problem.
What the FATF is doing is actually providing us with the instruments with which we can work. So they have the toolbox, and the FATF also ensures that all countries have to implement that. So we wouldn't have these powers that I'm speaking about without the FATF and their work on standard setting. Okay, sorry, but that's the key word, isn't it? Implementing it, Rick, and making it happen and making others work to it. Just before I go to that, I did want to ask you, Ruth, if I can. It's a perhaps slightly reactive approach from the banks, but you recognise the barometer is rising in terms of the risk. Why has it taken this long to recognise that for banks?
I don't know if necessarily it's taken a long time, but when Rick is talking about risk-based approach, a bank has finite resources. If we had to study every single transaction, we would have a financial crime team of about 10,000, and it would be completely and utterly economically unviable. So we have to decide what are the risks, and that's why we have the risk assessment. That's why we have to look at each customer on its merits and the business in which it works and work out how much does this client need scrutiny, how much is this client going to be a risk to our bank in terms of money laundering. So, and I think it's very interesting that, when FIFA obviously a number have been indicted, that is obviously going to set hairs running in banks, what's our exposure, have we been checking it, etc. That is quite reactive, because quite a lot of what we do is fairly reactive. Having said that, money is also being put into banks in developing their own financial intelligence units, horizon scanning for these types of emerging risks. Sporting organisations have always been on the agenda, and we've taken a particular view. Clearly, when enforcement action comes, then it does get ratcheted up because it's clearly a higher priority. And I think the really useful thing about having an intelligence unit is that you are able to do a bit more proactive monitoring, a little bit more horizon scanning, perhaps even, and there are some, I think, nascent moves to try and share intelligence where it is legally possible to do so within law enforcement, financial institutions, etc. We do see a lot of transactions, and we can benefit from the guidance that FATF gives us. We benefit from the intelligence that can be shared with us by law enforcement, and that all together really helps a collective team effort to actually preventing and detecting financial crime. I think is that it's not great that we have to do that in isolation from the people in the sporting industry. I think there needs to be some accountability from them as well. They need to be joining that train with us, with the banks, with the law enforcement, to help it become a much, much cleaner place to operate. Right, now you raise a really important point there, I think, about the role in which sports organisations should be playing in this. Jen, how much more could they do? In fact, how much or how little do you really feel they do at the moment?
Well, I think more can be done. I think that's certainly evident from what's been going on here over the last several months. There is a gap if in terms of self-regulation, sports bodies engaging in self-regulation, in terms of the information they have at their disposal to actually look into these matters. These are some pretty complex financial transactions underlying some of these alleged crimes, and they're international in scope. So being able to actually investigate that, get information about the transactions, understand what's behind the opaqueness is going to take quite a bit of information, and that information is residing on the side right now of governments and financial institutions, and those financial institutions are only allowed to share that information with governments. So there's a gap between those who might need information to self-regulate and investigate and governments. So I think we need to find some way to bridge that gap. And there's probably a few different ways to do that. One of them is to ensure, like we heard from our Swiss colleague today, that all governments have criminalized commercial corruption, because that's now the hook by which the banks and the governments can act. Making sure that throughout the organizations that you have a clear articulation of the official's fiduciary duty to that organization and a commitment not to engage in corrupt services, to engage in honest services. Those are the hooks that I think can start to bring sport on the one hand and the financial institutions and government on the other closer together.
Rick, I mentioned implementation, and you're setting up the tools and the wherewithal and the codes of conduct. What is the pace of change in terms of readiness to implement? Because, as we said before, easy to sign up, easy to put your name on the bottom of the page, but acting upon it is key, especially in such a multi-layered international business as money laundering within sport is.
Yes, I think implementation is obviously crucial. Countries have sovereignty, but in this area, and presumably in others, but in this, can you hear me? Is this working here? There are built-in mechanisms to try to ensure that governments who have signed up for this, and at the moment 195 have, those, I won't delay you with too much of the detail there, I'll come back to that if you want me to, but I think the important point is that the global effort in relation to money laundering through the FATF and our regional bodies has built-in requirements. We examine countries' compliance with the standards, a very rigorous examination on a cyclical basis, on a regular basis. We have a mechanism for what some people call naming and shaming blacklists and grey lists of countries that do not comply. That has had a remarkably galvanizing effect on getting at least the technical compliance up to a higher standard than it would otherwise have been. So we also have follow-up mechanisms, so we don't just examine whether a country at one given point in time is meeting the standards and to what degree it is. We have follow-up mechanisms where there are deficiencies, and that's done very regularly, every 4 months in fact, in relation to countries which are egregiously deficient. So there is an international peer mechanism, a set of mechanisms in place that are real pressure points. I think outside the governmental regulation, if I can use that term generically, there's also the issue of investment. Many companies, and for that matter, foreign direct investment, even by governments, do not want to send their money to a place that has a bad reputation. One thing that gives you a bad reputation is being vulnerable to money laundering or terrorist financing, which is also one of the standards. So there's an added incentive of a commercial nature, a realistic mechanism, to put it that, a real-world mechanism that makes them think again. So that is an added incentive to abide by the international standards, and that's in itself having an effect. So this is cumulative, so it's ratcheting up in terms of implementation. But could I say that there's nothing like, in a particular case, a good scandal to move things a bit faster.
Well, that's true. But from what you said, to the extent, Jen, that you are seeing a falling off of the risk or indeed of the activity of money laundering in football, for example?
I think it's too early to tell. That would be an awfully quick reaction. I think what we're seeing in early days is certainly a lot of attention being paid to the issue, which is likely, if we look historically at other issues like this, when there's a controversy, when there's a big kind of criminal scandal, a lot of attention is paid, the reporting goes up, and it puts governments in a place to deal with it with better data. It also, building on what Rick is saying in terms of the international standard setting and the ratcheting up, so to speak, of compliance in the money laundering realm, it does mewn that if you're considered high risk or your jurisdiction is considered high risk for money laundering, there are real economic downfalls to that. There are banks that will choose not to bank you. You may not be able to have accounts in a certain country or move funds a certain way, and those have real ramifications when you're talking about an international economic industry like sport. So there are real ramifications here that are commercial in nature and not just ethical and do it for the good of sport and that type of thing. There's economic interest at stake, there's liberty interest at stake, certainly if folks are going to face criminal prosecutions. And there's also criminal penalty, I think, issues at stake. If when you start talking about forfeiting criminal proceeds, taking away the houses that someone may have bought with the proceeds that they obtained from crimes. So there's definitely a connection back to economic interests.
Jane, is there one of the problems sport we know we've had in football in many cases and in many countries is that we have criminals who want to get into football or other big sports because that's a great way to legitimize what they've got and turn from perhaps being the Tony Sopranos of this world into part of a sort of more, I think you would call it, licit as opposed to illicit trade. Is there anything that is being and can be done about those characters?
It's really a very, very interesting phenomenon because people instinctively believe that if you're a criminal or you're a nefarious character, that the way you do business is nefariously, and you create illicit structures, systems, and flows to manage your enterprises and to manage your money. And in fact, what we know is that criminals use legitimate systems, legitimate banks, legitimate processes all the time. And they can be very, very difficult to detect. But as Jen said, I mean, law enforcement ultimately, whether it's the regulator of last resort, it is a very powerful tool that governments have to chase after criminals, whether they are manifesting in licit or illicit ways. This highlights really the importance of understanding in sport, as with so many other things that we ran into in Homeland Security and elsewhere, we need to understand the supply chain of trouble when it comes to sport. Trouble has a supply chain. It has points of origination and resources. It has distributors, wholesalers, retailers. And when you can understand the supply chain of trouble, for example, in corrupt sport at a massive scale, you create a number of points of intervention. And you can use the legitimate tools that we have available, whether it's standard setting or the role of banks. Banks are very, very powerful. They can stop business in a city, a region, a country. They can cut off business for nationals who are otherwise law-abiding, but they say, we're not going to do, we're going to close your account in 30 days because you're a national of X, Y, or Z, and we're just not going to do business with you anymore. That doesn't mean banks need to become governments. There's a lot that sports industry has to do to clean up its own act, but they're not going to be governments. So we really need to sit down and say, how are we going to distribute the responsibility for cleaning up sport, because it has to be cleaned up.
And Ruth, I know you've got to go in a minute, and we've got a chance for some questions and answers off the back of that. But I know that's not the reason you're going. You've got to fly, which is fine. So in a way, off the back of what Jane was saying there, how much do you feel that banks should be driving this now, in fact? I mean, you are in the perfect position to do that.
Yes, it's sort of a double-edged sword, really, isn't it? You know, we have a moral obligation and obviously regulatory obligations to try and detect this. We're not a detective agency, and we shouldn't be detective agencies. But what we need to do is make sure that we are not being used as a conduit, so we mustn't be asleep at the wheel. I think that the financial crime people that work within Barclays and in the industry generally are passionate about making sure that, you know, financial crime is detected and that the bad guys get caught. That's absolutely the way we all feel. And we want to develop the right tools and the right systems that are efficient and that allow us to do that. I think the banks are always going to be at the forefront because they play such an enormous role in society. They do see a huge amount of activity. It will be where the majority of the intelligence in this area comes from. But I think we also have to look to not only the sporting industry, but to the other gatekeepers, the lawyers, the accountants, the people who are even buying, you know, the properties for these people, who are doing their tax returns, etc. They are all subject to money laundering regulations. They all have a role to play, as much as the banks do. But, you know, to the extent that we often have to drive many of these things, it is probably just the nature of the way, you know, the role that we occupy in the society in any event.
Did you want to pick up on that, Jen?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to note, too, that banks have been in the forefront of financial crime and preventing financial crime vis-a-vis their counterparts in the financial industry, the rest of regulated industry. But the rest of that industry is coming along as well. And some of the very themes that came up here today, issues like the culture of compliance, not geographic culture, but having within a business or an industry a culture of compliance, are issues that we have grappled with in the AML area and continue to grapple with in the AML area, anti-money laundering area. I know I've been out speaking, and colleagues sitting across this dais have been out speaking about the need for industry to have a culture of compliance, that it comes from the top. And I think what we've seen is enforcement helps to wake folks up, for sure, in an industry, and then that allows the conversations to begin on the need for culture of compliance. And at that point, when those high-level officials in industry are starting to feel personal potential jeopardy, they're willing to listen. And that's where some of these good governance principles have come into being in our area. And we are seeing development, not just within the United States, but I think across the globe in terms of that culture. So I do think it is possible, and enforcement sometimes is just an impetus.
Okay, Jane.
It's probably just, you know, making the point that we haven't really mentioned advances in IT and cyberspace and communications and how that has made it easier for bad guys to do bad things using licit systems for their purposes. But it turns out actually you can hide money, although it's increasingly difficult, but you really can't move money without being detected. And here, technology, communications, and advances in cyberspace are aiding the good guys a lot.
So the noose is tightening from that respect, at least. Okay, we've got a few minutes now for some questions from you from the floor. We have a gentleman here, and then another gentleman just behind. So if you just let us know where you're from and who you are.
Simon Greenberg from News Corp. We're quite familiar with Department of Justice investigations, as you may know. But more generally, I wonder if you could sort of outline what the extent of the US's jurisdiction could be in terms of investigating money laundering and tax evasion and the abuse of the US dollar. Does it the perception of the current FIFA scandal is that because the offences took place on American soil or through the American banking system, that is your jurisdiction. But does the jurisdiction potentially go wider than that? So if a bribe is paid in a US dollar in Africa or in Asia, does the DOJ or the FBI believe it to have jurisdiction?
So we have a variety of tools in the United States, both criminal and otherwise, Treasury authorities as well, which is where I'm at now, to deal with money laundering. And really, they're all centered around protecting the U.S. financial system from criminal and national security threats. So in the money laundering sphere, domestic money laundering criminal cases are based on the movements of funds to, through, or from the United States, and that's what you'll see in criminal cases. When it comes to corruption, we have our Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and that's focused on if a U.S. company is engaged in bribery outside of the United States. We have certain jurisdiction over that. We have Treasury authorities, sanctions regimes, and even some authorities at FinCEN where we can have an external, a foreign effect, all aimed at protecting the U.S. financial system. So for example, we have an authority at FinCEN known as Section 311 of the Patriot Act that we could potentially pass a regulation that would prohibit our financial institutions from allowing or opening correspondent accounts for a foreign financial institution, a foreign jurisdiction, or a foreign class of accounts if we saw that foreign group to be of primary money laundering concern. The idea is to protect the U.S. financial system from that external threat.
I was going to say, you happy with that? Yeah,
well, no, I just
quickly,
want to, does that extend, the US financial system is underpinned by the US dollar, presumably. Does that extend down to the abuse of the dollar? So if there's proof of the US dollar being used in bribery between two individuals in Africa, for example?
So I think we're getting pretty technical on the law at this point, and so I'd be happy to talk to you offline, but at its very base, most of our authorities are focused on the flow of money to, through, or from the United States financial system.
And the U.S. activity in this space, I mean, so whether or not it's money laundering or bulk cash smuggling, which involves the transfer of physical assets, the United States not only has not only the extensiveness of its own jurisdiction, which can be very arcane, as we know, and very case specific. It also has a number of law enforcement agreements in place bilaterally with countries around the world to literally police this space.
Thank you. Yes, the chap in the white shirt. Were there some other hands? Did I miss that? Thank you. No, sorry, bear with me a second. We'll get that first. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Christopher Hill from Criskin Management. I think we made a lot of progress since this morning from policy to implementation. The gentleman mentioned one of the key points that we face as a family office which caters to professional athletes is the inability for us to get coherent information from the FINMA or other regulators as to what is and what is not acceptable. One of the things that I think that in the title should be changed is risks and cures for a clean sport. It actually is a business. I think we should be more catered to the idea that risk and cures for an efficient sport business, because Scorpio did a study in 2000 and it takes it down to the grass business. It's $1 trillion industry. And as Mr. Homeland, some of you may remember him, once told me, where there's a lot of money, there's a lot of criminals, and very sophisticated. So how are you going to address that if both the United States and Europe are not on the same, I would say, level in terms of efficiency and competence?
Daniel, could I start with you on that?
Well, I actually don't see so many differences between the approach the United States is taking and Europe. In that case, it started with a US investigation because there was crime in the US. If it were the other way around, it would have been the other way around. I see cases that we start and there's a link to another country and that other country would follow up. So I don't see a major difference in the approach here. But what you write about is, we're talking about businesses here, and sometimes I have the impression some of these businesses see themselves as a sports organization and say that's why all these rules don't apply to us, and that's wrong. I would be interesting to see if there's a correlation between actually the money involved in a specific sports sector and the level of crime or perceived crime. I assume it could be that the more money is involved, the higher the risk of being involved in crime is true. And that's logic. That applies to all other sectors. So why should it not apply to that kind of business? And if we're sure about that, then it could be interesting to say, why don't we take the money out? You know, because the money comes from sponsors, the money comes from public broadcasting companies. Why do we need so much money in that business at all? It may even have negative impact on that. Football exists since, I don't know, I don't play for that long, but 150 years or so, and it started without that much money, and it was fun 50 years ago, and it's still fun. But actually, that's maybe a question we should ask ourselves. How do we manage to limit the amount of money in it? Or, if there is so much money in it and we need it, why don't we make it fully transparent? Shouldn't then be an obligation of making every transaction transparent because of the inherent risk?
Okay, thank you. Do we want an American comment, or are we happy with that?
We're happy with that.
We're happy with that. Okay, well, if we are, we'll move straight on. I think hands up again, so I know. Jens.
Jens Andersen, Play the Game. It's actually a follow-up question to this, because it's very telling that it is US law enforcement that has created the most dynamic sports political challenges in the past 20 years. The Salt Lake City scandal, the Lance Armstrong scandal, and now the FIFA scandal. We don't know where that will end. Everybody can theoretically be acquitted, but we think there must be some substantial storytelling in those FBI documents. Now, since you say that, I would like to turn the question a little bit around, because I don't think any US authority has actually done this to change sport politics. I think FBI couldn't care less. They want to protect US taxpayers' money. But do you, as Americans, see that somehow you have a less sentimental or more cynical approach to the sports organizations? And is there anything you would wish from the Europeans to do more consequently than you see today?
Okay, thank you. Jane?
We're incredibly sentimental about our sports. Jen mentioned her own sports background and her brother's. My daughter, our 11-year-old, the daughter is a member of the 4-time national champion short track speed skating team in the United States. These kids train twice a day, 6 days a week, and there are millions of them across the United States in every sport. And football, by the way, is becoming very, very big and popular in the United States, and it will be big and popular before it's big business in the US. There's a big movement, and there's a great deal of accountability among the leadership of sporting federations, the NFL, for example, on domestic violence and abuse, on concussions and the consequences for brain injury, on the legacy and the treatment of retired athletes and the lives they lead in their retirement age. And there are all these dimensions that are really bringing the accountability of sport above the fold, as we say in the newspaper, and to the forefront of the news. I mean, hardly a day goes by without one of the major sporting institutions having to account for what's happening. And the good news is, there's a lot of good news also. We like our teams, and I'm from New York. We love our teams. So there's greater accountability. The FBI, in this case, is doing its job. Did the problem in FIFA become too big to ignore? And why did it take the United States? You know, there's a saying, and I'll leave you with this thought. There's a saying, perhaps apocryphal, that's attributed to Abba Eban, talking about the circumstances in the Middle East. He said, you know, with the US, anything is possible. Without the US, nothing is possible. Now, we might appreciate the first part of that sentence, but none of us can afford a world in which the latter is true.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll also hear to that, but one might wonder. Jane, thank you. I think that was the last question. We are out of time. So once again, could I ask you to express your appreciation to our panel? Jane, Rick, Jen, and Daniel, thank you all very much indeed for that. Much appreciated. We have the opportunity for a quick break, quick cup of tea or coffee, straight back in at the top of the hour, please, as we move on to the third part of our day. Thank you very much.